This week on The Futurists, Monica Anderson.
In the world at the large, is that science is going to lose its prime position as being the way we tackle the most complicated problems.
Hello and welcome back to yet another edition of The Futurists. I'm Rob Tercek with my co-host, Brett King. Hi, Brett.
Hey.
Welcome back from your travels. It's good to see you again.
You say it's like every week we start with that, right? Welcome back.
It's true. You're a globetrotter. I love it. I love hearing about it. So this time you were in Europe.
I was. London and Paris was a great trip. Had Miss Metaverse with me, Katie.
Oh, nice.
So we were able to hang out in Paris. It was wonderful.
Can't beat that. Paris in the spring, my favorite. So while you were traveling, the world of AI continues to evolve and explode and expand, and there's new headlines and new stories and new papers every single day. It seems like the topic we can't avoid. Everybody we've interviewed on this show brings it up. Even a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed an expert on the future of law. Right. And of course, the conversation veered into AI because it's an unavoidable topic.
You can't talk about the future without addressing how AI is going to change it, for sure.
So one of the people who's been most refreshing in my news feed is an AI researcher who calls herself an experimental epistemologist. And she comes to us by way of Sweden. Her name is Monica Anderson. And I wanted to invite her on the show for quite some time. And it felt like this was the perfect moment. So, Brett, give a big welcome to Monica Anderson.
Hey, Monica.
Thank you for having me.
Happy to have you here, Monica. Tell me something. This term, an experimental epistemologist, is going to throw people. It certainly threw me. Can you tell me what you mean by that term?
Well, if you're going to work in artificial intelligence today, when everything is focused on these large language models and neural networks and deep learning and the stuff that's been going on since 2012, you have to realize that basically we are talking about something that hasn't happened before, something we haven't dealt with before. And in order to understand that fully, we have to go below science. Science, we talk about the first principles of science as being very important to not be misled by various other factors. But in AI, that's not enough. You have to go to the zeroth level. And the zeroth level of science would be the level of epistemology, because science is built on top of epistemology.
So for the folks who are listening, epistemology.
What is epistemology?
Yeah. It refers to our understanding of knowledge, or how the mind perceives reality.
Correct. And that's the key issue, is that we are trying to create our own minds, and they have to have reality and the perception of reality that's useful. And we have to know how to do that. And
if I got you right, you mentioned the zeroth level. So we hear people like Elon Musk frequently talks about first principles, right? This is considered a sound way to do engineering and problem solving. You start with first principles and expand from there. But you're saying there's a level below first principles, and that's the zero level.
Yes, and in order to understand why that's necessary, we have to understand the limits of science. And I have discussed that at length in several videos. But I can give a flavor of that by a simple example. Suppose you're back in grammar school, and the teacher gives us a story problem. She says, Holly is 4 years old. She has 3 boxes of chocolates, and there are 6 boxes of chocolates in each box. How many chocolates does Holly have? And somebody will pipe up and say 18, and I typically say in my talk, I said, that's almost right. It's actually 18 chocolates. And if you're an epistemologist, you understand why you have to add those chocolates to the answer. Now, those are easy questions. The answer 18 chocolates is basically what science would give us, given this example. The question that science cannot understand.
What is chocolate?
No, simpler than that. Suppose you're trying to solve this problem and you come up with 18. How did you know you had to multiply? How did you know that the age, that Holly's age 4 didn't factor in? How do you know that you had to multiply?
So knowing what's important or what's relevant is a key to the understanding. This is the domain that you're in. And so now help me relate that to AI, because one of the things you've described in your writing is the reductive approach, is that the scientist or the person who's doing the inventing decides what's important and they discard all the rest.
Correct.
But you're suggesting now that the approach with AI is to give it everything and let the AI determine what's important.
Exactly right. That is exactly how it works. So we are basically, what we're doing is we're delegating the understanding of the problem itself. We're delegating the understanding of the problem domain, the problem at hand, etc., to the AI, to the point where the researchers themselves don't have to understand the problem. And this is obviously what we want AI to do. We want AI to think for us so that we don't have to. That's the whole point of having an artificial intelligence.
And this is the domain called deep learning, right? That's what we're referring to. It's not all AI.
This is everything that basically provides the service that we expect artificial intelligence to do. My technical definition of artificial intelligence is any system that's capable of autonomous epistemic reduction, a system that can on its own determine what matters and learn that and not learn all the noise, for instance.
But in your writing, you say that there's a kind of a fundamental conflict in the way we go about science today that leads to kind of cognitive dissonance. In fact, you argue that the whole field of science is conflicted this way, that it has a fundamental cognitive dissonance, and that's between this reductive approach and a holistic approach. The holistic approach being, here is the whole mess, here's the whole complex scenario. Hey, AI, you go figure it out. And exactly. You're saying that approach is kind of radical, right? The way scientists typically would approach a problem like that is they'd break it down into constituent parts and then solve each piece, and hopefully the parts fit together.
Before they get breaking it down, they have to understand the problem. There's no way around it. Before you can reason about anything, before you can break it down in a reductionist fashion, you have to understand it. So the understanding is the more fundamental principle. And the understanding, it turns out, can't be done scientifically.
You mean the understanding of human thinking, the thought process?
Understanding of any problem domain.
So for AI, we talk a lot about, guide rails, in terms of things like ethical considerations and so forth. And we know that the quality of the data models that go into the LLMs and so forth are critical for establishing these types of guide rails. Is that part of the solution to the problem, or is LLM effectively, not able to grasp some of these fundamentals, or there's no structure for that sort of fundamental epistemological understanding?
This is a question that has more relevance in the short term than in the long term. We don't know what it's going to look like even 5 years from now. But we can definitely say that, okay, so in my post about AI alignment is trivial, I basically tried to explain that skills and behaviors and wants and needs and all of these things are learnable. We have already seen ChatGPT 3.5 knows English at the level of a college educated person and has very little knowledge about arithmetic, can't even do simple arithmetic. And in humans, that kind of a discrepancy is very unusual. So people who look at the earliest LLMs and their behaviors, they are basically saying that this is very strange. This got to be wrong. But if we accept that these skills, such as arithmetic and English, are very separable, we can look at what else the system has in the way of skills. And we notice that all behaviors are just skills. You can learn to snowboard, you can learn Finnish language, there's all kinds of stuff that we can learn or not. And then we look at behavior as such, and we understand that behaviors such as greed and power hungriness and deceit and so on, all these behaviors, they are learned. And we learn them as humans, we learn them partly through our evolutionary history, because we have a limbic system, we have a lizard brain. And the lizard brains and limbic system, those are what keep us competing, that's also what keeps us power hungry, those are what keeps us trying to climb up and be on top. And this, we don't have to put in our AIs. And
right. So that we can have, because the AIs can be for the common good rather than individual success.
It's more about evolutionary theory, Brett. The idea is that AIs didn't evolve the way humans evolved over millennia.
Right.
They
And
are
so,
not a product of evolution, they're a product of intelligent design in my brain and others, in the mind of scientists.
so the intelligent designer can choose not to include behaviors, competitive behaviors and dominating behaviors and so forth. So you're saying that those arose through a Darwinian process of natural selection in humans.
Yep.
And so when we worry about things like an AI taking over the world or AI is killing us, you hear people speculate about this all the time. It's kind of a common science fiction scenario. But in your view, that's unlikely to happen unless we intentionally design that behavior or that motivation into the AI.
Exactly. That is basically it's an anthropocentric view to believe that our AIs would be like ourselves. Now, there are many ways in which AIs are like we are because it's inherent in how understanding works and so on. But there's also ways in which we can make them completely different because we have complete control over what behaviors we want. Specifically, I should like to mention that the world is a dirty place, especially if you feed it internet as the main corpus. Understand from it's going to see a lot of the nasty behaviors and greed and other stuff on the web and bias and discrimination and all of that stuff. But we can't take that out of the corpus. It has to be there because if we take it out, then we're learning the system on a Pollyanna model of the world. And that's not going to work when it actually gets down to try to solve some real problems. The problems are going to be in the dirty world. So we have to give it a complete view of the world, everything, holistic, etc. We have to give it everything we have. And then after the fact, we have to give it behaviors in a separate path. And that's already happening. OpenAI is doing the behavior in a reinforcement learning with human feedback process, and other things like that, including supervised learning based on previous RLHF sessions. And that is the way you get behaviors in there. And we have full freedom to put in politeness and helpfulness and other things and avoid greed and power hungriness and take over the world kind of things.
So these are the guardrails that Brett was just referring to a minute ago.
Yeah.
It always strikes me when we have this sort of conversation about the theoretical formation of consciousness or intelligence at an AI level. We always put human nature and human values upon AI. But we already have AI, in some areas, divergent from human logic, So I've always felt that, when we talk about, for example, AI is taking over the world and enslaving mankind, that is a very human type of value system, right? Rather than
we're saying a lot about ourselves when we talk about that.
Right,
It's like
but
we're revealing our worst motivations.
Right, but this is a different type of intelligence, and there's no guarantee that it's going to follow that path, especially if we can come up with the right guide rails. So, I guess philosophically, where do you sit on that, Monica?
Well, for better or for worse, they are going to be more human-like than we're used to, and they're going to be less human-like than we expect or at least hope for. The places where they're going to be human-like is that they're going to make human-like mistakes. We remember expert systems from the 90s and 80s, and they were very brittle. They were basically, you hard-coded a competence in some domain, such as approving house loans or something like that. But if you start talking football with them, they will completely fall flat on their face. And the mistakes that these AI systems, the expert systems made were expensive, spectacular, and hard to fix. And today we have basically machines that make many mistakes, but they're human-like mistakes. They're almost correct. We can often immediately correct them if we find them and so on, and achieve the fix. So this is, we're getting closer. The more we appreciate the human part of AI, the more we have to tolerate the human tendency to.
I mean, there's pros and cons of making AIs human-like, right? I mean, like people are talking about these hallucinations, like we can't trust AI because they hallucinate or they lie, and it's like, well, humans do that all the time. All you have to do is look at the CNN town hall the other day, right? But so that's not necessarily something that should preclude AI from existing because it's human-like, but we can can eliminate some of those things. We can try to make, as you say, with those guide rails, make AI more consistent, as a class. But again, this comes back.
That's
back
actually
to
happening
sort
right
of
now,
the
right?
role of what we want AI to play in society to some extent.
So that's like 5 questions, and I have to.
No, I know. I was just riffing.
So the places where we cannot avoid them being very similar to us, to our frustration, is basically exactly in the level or caused by, or explained by epistemology. The most important things that I have basically been talking about since 2006 in my outreach has been basically that we can look at, like, if you will, 3 laws of AI epistemology. And the first one says that omniscience is unavailable. You can't be aware of what's happening in the world. You don't know what, if you want to predict Apple's stock price a week from now, you don't know what happens in their boardroom or in Taiwan or whatever. And the second one is that all corpora are incomplete. No matter what you try to teach your artificial intelligence, you're not going to have a complete corpus. You're going to not cover all the corner cases, etc. So the system will be ignorant in everything that you didn't tell it. And in humans, we don't notice that because we have an enormous corpus going back to birth. Everything we see and everything we heard since birth is part of our corpus. And AIs have limited corpora. We think they're gigantic, but they're puny compared to human. And the big reason that they lie to us is because they know much less. They're much more ignorant than we are. If it's not in the corpus, they don't know it. And so we are not used to that, again, binary on or off for knowledge. And so a lot of people think that the AIs lie to us more than they do, because they like to push the boundaries. And it's like, I like to say that a lot of this noise we've heard about ChatGPT 3 and 3.5, etc., lying to you, is basically like adults tricking kids, underage kids, to say stupid stuff so they can post.
Right.
So
yeah, that's a good illustration.
You have to work hard to get Bing or to get ChatGPT to hallucinate. It's not something that's going to naturally rise in a normal interaction. Although to Brett's point, Microsoft has now put strict limits on what you can do with the GPT in Bing. For that very reason, right?
That is the trend. I looked at the end user license agreement for Google's Bard, and it basically says you can't do anything nasty with this. And that's how they're guarding themselves now. They're putting it in the EULA.
But you think that's a temporary solution?
Oh, yeah, that will get better because they learn more. And we either have to get better algorithms or bigger machines or better corpora. We don't know which dimension we're going to improve this in. And I'm in the better algorithms category. But they will get much better very quickly, and
because they're learning, they
will learn.
And you can see that too when you use ChatGPT. If it gives you an erroneous answer, you can just say, "Please check your answer for accuracy." You don't have to tell it what mistake it made. You just ask it to check its answer, and it will. And you can see it learning on the spot, which I think is kind of impressive. I've never seen a machine learn on its own.
It's not learning at that point, really. It's just modifying its history. Learning is a much
right. It's we call it reinforcement learning, right? Because we're reinforcing the correct results. Yeah,
I'm seeing learning on a daily basis, so I'm less jaded to that for 20 years.
Just before we get into the quickfire round, which we do before the break, you started on this in 2001, which was fairly early in the deep learning cycle.
Absolutely. Yes.
How has the practice of deep learning changed over the last 20 years or so?
Well, it's gotten a lot better recently, but that's because there's tens of thousands of researchers working on it. I mean, Hinton, and so it's fuzzy who came up with what, but from end of the 90s to 2006, we were basically multiple people were working on getting neural networks going, including myself. And I was the only one, as far as I know, that was using discrete neurons. But Hinton and others, they basically had it licked by 2006, and then in 2012 it swept the world, and now we have the LLMs, and which is basically what I've been aiming at since the start. But I am calling mine SSMs because they're small syntax models, and the difference is that they are 1,000,000 times cheaper to learn and 1,000,000 times less energy to learn. But they run equally fast, and we don't know what their capabilities are yet. They are definitely good enough for classification, which is 90% of what you want to do with natural language in the industry.
Pattern recognition, yeah.
Yes, classification of messages, spam by topic in news feeds, etc. But ChatGPT and what GPT family is capable is basically completion and dialogue, and those are more complicated API calls that I have not yet licked. So I'm working on it, but it might be far away, and it may not even be possible.
Let's pick this conversation up in the second half. What we like to do now is we like to get to know you, like to help our audience understand how you got started and how you arrived at thinking about the future. So we typically ask a few questions here for very short answers, just a quick series of questions. And Brett, why don't you like to do this? You like to do this, and why don't you go ahead and do it?
What was the first science fiction you remember being exposed to on TV or in books?
Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein.
Good choice.
Take it back. I take it back. It was actually Have Spacesuit Will Travel. Have Spacesuit Will Travel.
Very cool.
Turns out that's also the first book that we train our AIs on.
Interesting. Well, that was also going to be one of the questions, is what was your first exposure to AI?
Oh, I was teaching AI to college students in the 1980s.
Okay. What technology has most changed humanity to date?
The biggest change ever is basically the invention of reductionism. That's my opinion. That's the biggest invention we ever done. It beats fire. But recently, basically having the ability to perform epistemic reduction. I mean, yeah, anything since 2006 that has done with neural networks is very different and very, very important.
Interesting. Name a futurist, a researcher, or entrepreneur that has influenced you personally, and why?
Let's see. William Calvin, professor emeritus at the University of Washington, has written a handful of books about neural Darwinism, which is basically the idea that in the brain, from millisecond to millisecond, there is a competition between ideas, and we are evolving our thoughts. And my systems are based on that.
Very interesting. And is there any story that you know of in popular fiction regarding artificial intelligence that represents the type of future you think that you hope for?
Absolutely. The first half of the movie Her.
Good. That's a good answer. All right, great. Well, that's it for the first half. You're listening to The Futurists. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. Provoke Media is proud to sponsor, produce, and support the Futurist podcast. Provoke.fm is a global podcast network and content creation company with the world's leading fintech podcast and radio show, Breaking Banks. And of course, its spin-off podcasts, Breaking Banks Europe, Breaking Banks Asia Pacific, and the FinTech 5. But we also produce the official Finovate podcast, Tech on Reg, Emerge Everywhere, the podcast of the Financial Health Network, and Next Gen Banker. For information about all our podcasts, go to provoke.fm or check out Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show.
And we're back in The Futurists with our guest, Monica Anderson. Monica is an artificial intelligence researcher and has been researching large language models since 2001. But she describes herself as an experimental epistemologist, and I want to dig into that a little bit. So one of the things that epistemology is concerned with is, how do we know things? How do we understand things? How does the mind understand the world? And you describe a fundamental cognitive dissonance that arises because our scientific methodology is reductionist. And you posit something that's an alternative to it, holism. Can you define these two terms and help our audience understand what you mean about reductionism and holism?
Well, those terms go back a long ways, and they are tainted by various bad connotations. Like reductionism is often blamed for bad science, and holism is often blamed for fuzziness and getting things wrong and jumping to conclusions. Well, first of all, the definitions for holism and reductionism that we use for a long time are weak, and they missed one of in my opinion, I looked at that in 2005 timeframe. They are missing something important here. And the thing that they are missing, if you go to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and look at reductionism, there have all kinds of stuff that all is very similar. And it basically, in my view, I said reductionism is the use of models. And models are scientific models, equations, hypotheses, theories, etc. Even superstitions are models. They're simplifications of reality that allows us to compute on them. Mm-hmm. And holism is simply the avoidance of such models. How can you get anything done if you're not using models, says the reductionist. And it turns out that it's the other way around. Almost everything we do on a daily basis is not done scientifically. If you're making breakfast, you're not making hypotheses about what the breakfast is like. You're just doing it. So the world breaks down into basically, if you look at all the problem-solving methods in the world, they go into two categories. They go into categories where we use models, and they are basically the scientific, the complicated things. And then they are the things where we don't bother, or we cannot use models. And then we have to solve them directly in the problem domain. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, in weather reporting, if you want to see the weather, if you want to know if it rains, you can watch the weather report, which gathers scientific information from multiple satellites and other sensors, or you can just open a window and smell if it smells like rain, and that's solving the problem in the problem domain. And everything we do on a daily basis is pretty much done unscientifically, even for scientists. We are just basically doing what worked last time. We are remembering what works, reusing that, and the only requirements for being able to do that is to have a good pattern matcher that tells you when two situations are the same, we can apply the same solution to the new one, perhaps in modifications.
One of the distinctions you make is the distinction between complicated problems that can be solved with this model-based approach, yes, and complex problems where the model simply will fail because the model won't replicate the sheer complexity. So talk to me a little bit about the distinction between complicated problems and complex problems.
Yes, complicated problems are basically the kind of stuff we do with science. We break down the trip to the moon into smaller and smaller parts until we have a component we can fabricate. But that approach didn't work, for instance, with protein folding. It doesn't work with language understanding. It doesn't work with plain Go. These require other kinds of solutions. And an example of that is that for instance, they may contain things that Professor Kenneth Stanley talks about as things that you cannot find by looking for them. You have to basically look at a whole bunch of stuff and make little tiny deductions, but you make little tiny correlations between them. Basically, intelligence is largely a matter of correlation discovery. And once you find those correlations, you tie them together and they form webs. And these webs, in some sense, have weights. In the case of deep learning, they have actual weights. And in my case, they do other things. But what results from this thing where you basically solve a number of problems, you don't even know if you have to use the solutions. In the top end, you get a solution that actually works in most cases. And that's the way the brain works. And that's what we have to make our artificial intelligence also do.
So let me see if I've got this, as an illustration, and I'm trying to come to grips with this. Is we have the James Webb Space Telescope right now, and it's discovering things like very large galaxies near the boundary of the known universe from the Big Bang that seem to challenge the Big Bang theory itself. So going back and revisiting Einstein's theory of relativity and whether the Big Bang is real as sort of the basis of our scientific thinking of how the universe is formed is tougher than using that as the baseline for assumptions. But where does that get us in terms of sort of path to scientific discovery?
I have to disappoint you by saying that I don't think AI is going to be any help in that regard. Well, it will help in analyzing the data, but for instance, getting the James Webb Space Telescope up there was almost entirely a reductionist feat. It was engineering through and through for decades, and the results, we have to understand the results, but I have no comment on that. I can't it's not my field.
Okay.
So you're not rejecting this reductivist approach. You're observing that it does work. It solves some problems. It solves certain problem categories.
Yes,
but that there's another category of problem where reductionism simply can't solve the problem, where you have to tackle the whole of it. It's irreducibly complex.
Exactly. And I have a video about that called Bizarre Systems, which is basically, it turns out that the remaining hard problems in the world, this used to include language understanding, cannot be solved with reductionist methods. And what's happening now is basically in the world at large, I mean, is that science is going to lose its prime position as being the way we tackle the most complicated problems, because we can now unload them to artificial intelligences and let them solve it for us. And that means that we are basically saying, okay, this reductionism stuff, it worked fine for 400 years, but we now are going to fix the problems that we couldn't solve using these hacks of science, so to speak. We have to solve them the way we solve all other problems in our daily environment, and that's going to be holistically. And there's two ways to do that. We can either write special programs that work holistically, that solve special problems. For instance, we could create something that tries to understand the stock market using holistic principles. Or we can just build AIs that are general enough that we can basically let them solve the problems as they come along. And either way, we have abdicated our own understanding of the problem. And I think that's a good thing.
Now, you mentioned the stock market as one such problem as an example, but what kinds of problems can science currently not solve? Are you talking about things like climate change? Is it simply too complex? And you believe that
big system stuff,
an AI might be able to address that?
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of domains like that. Like I said, language, how the brain works, drug interactions in the human body, cellular biology, the stock market, the global economy,
immigration movements.
Those are
patterns,
they go into political landscape that is very complicated. And in fact, the trick of governing a country or a world is one of these holistic problems. I wish that our politicians were holists. And in some sense, a lot of them are, because if you have a legal education background, you are smack in the middle of epistemic reduction, because the point of a jury is to do the epistemic reduction from the complicated crime situation to determining yes or no, is the defendant guilty or not. And that's basically, they're doing an epistemic reduction of something very complicated. And we wish that we had AIs that could do that, because they could be more impartial than juries.
Right. I mean, the legal system is one of those prime examples of where AI is going to be used, obviously, in terms of justice.
Well, we had a really rich debate about that topic just a week ago.
Back and listen to that,
with the legal futurist, and his perspective was probably not. And the reasoning is that we place primacy on human judgment. So we still have respect for judges. Monica, what's your take on that? Brett just articulated a view that I think makes sense, that someday you'll have push button justice. You can simply go to AI and get real justice, as opposed to the rough justice we get in the current system.
This is going to happen the way everything else happens here. As things get better, we're going to have more and more cries for using them compulsorily. For instance, you go to the doctor today, the AMA might say the doctor cannot use AI, and a month later they say, okay, now you can use it, and 6 months later they say, now you have to use it, and then they say, if you don't use this, we're going to pull in your license. And so this kind of, I see this kind of progression happen in many domains, where we more and more going to insist on AIs because they have a better betting average than the humans in the same situations.
People have been saying that about vehicles, though, for years. Yes. They've been saying that we'll do this with autonomous vehicles, that someday they'll be so good that you won't be allowed to drive, that human drivers will be barred from driving. But we're nowhere near that today. We're nowhere near that.
I made that prediction in my book of Winter.
Let me point out that 6 months ago, we were nowhere near that either. And we are a lot closer today. I mean, the stuff is getting better. It's a matter of machine size, corpus size computation, algorithm power, and a few other things like that. But it's all going in the same direction. And we all know roughly what the quality requirements are. And we'll get there. It'll just take some time. And the reason people are upset over AI making so many mistakes is that they are given the first opportunity ever to be witnessing when the sausage is being made for the first time.
Right.
And they are shocked at how complicated and how error prone it is. And come on, have you seen what happens when you're building airplanes from scratch?
Yeah. And you know, that's a good example because airplanes have autopilots that do 90% of the flying. That didn't used to be the case, right?
Well, it's been over the decade, it's been the case that the weather is bad, the pilot is not allowed to land himself.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though. I think people would hesitate to get on a plane that was completely autonomous. I don't think most.
Well, so
passengers would
I mean,
come-
I think the way it's going to go is I think it's going to go where you will have the autonomy portion of it. You know, actually Emirates is talking about this right now. They're going to move to single pilot operation during the flight using artificial intelligence. So what that means is instead of carrying a secondary crew on the flight, one of the pilots will be able to go into the crew sleep time. There'll be a single pilot running the flight with the AI. Now, this is not a significant increase in risk because this is actually what happens mostly today. But those models are getting better. So it's just the takeoff and landing where, you know, you have the highest potential for an issue where you need the 2 human pilots. So it definitely will reduce the need for having more flying staff, you know, flight crew on the aircraft. But I think, and then once we get comfortable with that, then it's a step to a single pilot operations for the entire flight. Right?
And I think your main point there is we're already experiencing that. We just don't know. You know, like
we used to have 5. We used to have 5 flight crew. We used to have 5 flight crew. We used to have a radio operator. We used to have a navigator. We used to have 2 pilots and a backup. Right. That's how we used to do it years ago. So we've already made, you know, on that spectrum, we've already made significant progress. So
understood. Let me redirect to Monica here for a sec. So Monica, this topic has come up several times on our show where we talk about autonomous systems for transportation. And there's a little bit of a debate. Some people say that the intelligence will be in the cloud. Because we have an unlimited capacity in the cloud. Other people say, nope, that's way too risky because if there's a disconnect in the telecoms network, that system has to run on its own. So the intelligence has to be on the car or on the airplane. What's your perspective about that? Are we going to be able to run these gigantic language models locally in a car or in an airplane? Or will we not be relying on large language models in the future?
First of all, we are not running LLMs in our cars. For instance, in Tesla, there is special made software that has nothing to do with the LLMs. He has to train basically on we started with AI in the cars because we needed the vision.
Mm-hmm.
We need to understand how the vision works, what was around us. Is that a fire hydrant? Is that a pedestrian? And so that was solved. With neural networks, there's no other way to do that. And that is a holistic solution, if you will, a holistic flavored solution. But then there's all this...
In the sense that the cars are learning, that they're being trained.
Pattern recognition.
They learn the hard way, basically.
They learned it how to understand vision. Mm-hmm. And starting with that, then they had a second phase, which was reductionist, which was regular programming that took whatever the vision part had, and they converted it they basically analyzed that, and using programs, they decided what the rules of traffic should be, how the car should behave. And over the years, they have removed more and more of that, and now almost everything is one single neural network or multiple neural networks communicating with each other.
When you say multiple neural networks, so the Tesla cars are connected, and famously they learn from each other, right? This is one of the powers of Tesla. Is that
there's still one thing to remember here is that there is a lot of times when you think about AI doing something for you, what you're looking at is doing something in the inference phase. It is not learning there. Teslas don't learn as you're driving, or they only learn overnight when they get a new version. And so what happens is that when you're driving your Tesla, you're encountering a dangerous situation, hitting the brake or whatever, the car records that. And in the evening, when you park at home, it uploads it to the cloud to Tesla, and they can analyze that video and other things like when you push the brake pedal and whatever.
Oh, so the connectivity is it's not critical while you're driving. Right. Most of what you need is on board, and then it updates.
I don't know if they use a continuous connection. I know that they connect when you get home.
Okay. But
use
it is true that we're moving into a phase, let's say post large language models. We're moving into a phase where large language models may be a thing of the past. That's what the CEO of OpenAI recently said.
Yes, I agree with him for very strange reasons, which is that I have models that are much, much smaller myself. Like I said, they can learn 1 million times faster than the models that OpenAI is using.
And there are already models that can run on an iPhone. This is kind of amazing. Like this all came out in the last month or so.
Again, there's two different situations. The one situation is that the system is learning, and that requires a cloud and hundreds of computers for months if you're going to make an LLM. For Tesla, it means that they're running it on the dojo for some amount of time. I don't know how long it takes, but it might take weeks. Then what the thing does is it emits a model, a large language model, which is a significantly smaller chunk. And that smaller chunk you can put in a computer on the cloud, and then that will become your GPT server, and it is what you're talking to when you're analyzing a ChatGPT interaction. But these things are frozen. So are my own systems. I have a server in the cloud which is also frozen. So they basically, you learn at the factory, and then you freeze the intelligence, you shrink it, you throw away everything that has to do with learning, and you just keep the model, and that model is what you're serving either in the cloud or in your iPhone or in your car. Much smaller. And for GPT specifically, for GPT 3.5, it had 120 gigabyte memory model. It's fit in 5 large GPU cores of 24 gig each. That's still small compared to what it took to learn. In my case,
you sent me a note about homeschooled AIs. You sent me an intriguing message about homeschooled AIs. What did you mean by that?
I mean that our computers are getting stronger. Our laptops, our home computers are getting stronger. At some point, they will reach the point where the simplest AI models can be learned at home. And I myself have that because I am working on a much, like I said, my AI models can be taught on much smaller computers. They still require a lot of memory, but I can get started on a laptop. And on the cloud, for instance, on my main published website, experimentalepistemology.ai, in chapter 9, I demonstrate basically how, in chapter 8, I demonstrate the system can learn English in 5 minutes on a laptop. And
that's pretty impressive.
That's very impressive. And then chapter 9 talks about how you can access that in the cloud. It is not as good as language models. These are small syntax models, but they are good for classification.
But if we're going to be doing agency-based AI, so an agent AI that acts on our behalf, it has to only learn a set of behaviors about how we would respond in those instances.
That is a much bigger deal. I don't do that at this point. I'm trying to create a replacement for transformers and large language models.
Tell me what the impact for consumers will be. What would the impact on a regular user of a computer or a person who's using their smartphone? How will their experience change?
Well, basically, it depends on who you are, what you want to do with your AI. So a lot of people will just be happy with whatever AI is available. And I've been sketching a future in where there are thousands of AIs that have various different biases and capabilities, and they all have subscription prices with them, and you go to your iPhone settings and you decide which AI to use this week, and you basically unsubscribe to the previous one and subscribe to this one, and it will come with new set of biases and features. And we're going to start changing those on a regular basis because there's going to be so many of them.
You know, I have to point out that right now,
like apps, right?
The business model for generative AI seems to be take the money and run, because they're charging you $200 up front for a year's access. And it's quite clear the logic behind that decision, that pricing model, is they know darn well in a year there'll be a much better AI from somebody else. And they're like, let's grab the money now and sell you a year of service. You won't be using it a year from now. You'll be using something else. This is what I'm observing, is there's just been a proliferation of new variant AIs. And now with Llama leaking out into the public domain, you have this crazy frenzy of open source activity that's happening, such that it's almost impossible to keep up with the new announcements that are coming out. Give us a little forecast. Like, what can we expect by 2024, just a year into the future? What will this landscape look like?
Oh, it's hard to tell because it all depends on how popular my stuff gets, and it's not popular yet, and it doesn't quite work the way I want it yet. But yes, if things go according to plan, and it doesn't have to involve me, by the way, there's other people who are working on similar stuff, but we can see AI systems that can learn much more effectively than what current transformers can. And I have a serious theory about how that is possible, and it could be interesting to touch upon that if you have a few minutes.
Yeah, hit us. This is the part of the show where you should get expansive.
Let's get out there.
So this is controversial, and a lot of that is conjecture on my part. So take this with a grain of salt. But what happened in AI was that basically in 2006 and onward, we got these systems that understood vision. Handwritten recognition of digits was what we started with, and it went all the way up to these AI art systems that can manipulate stuff at will. But in the beginning, we started with vision, or rather, Hinton and friends started with vision, and that was what was vision-derived technology. Was basically what won in 2012. Then they wanted to get into text. And as it happens, they had something already. They had Word2Vec, which was this idea that you could create a semantic space of word vectors. And you could say basically king minus man plus woman equals queen. And you could do this kind of arithmetic in this semantic space. And everybody thought it was really cool. And so what they did was they used these word vectors to convert text to images. So all the deep learning that deals with text starting after 2012 or so is basically doing it by converting the text to an image and then processing that. And this conversion from text to image, they felt it was necessary because they wanted the semantics. So deep learning and transformers, they get the majority of their semantics from the Word2Vec. So they start with the semantics. Now, if you ask yourself, if you wanted to analyze language, if you wanted to learn language, what should you learn first, syntax or semantics? And it turned out deep learning learned the semantics first. They learn it before they even start learning syntax. And because they're doing it that way, they have to schlep the information about semantics around throughout the learning of syntax. And this is why they need GPUs, because it became so expensive. They turned a one-dimensional problem into a two-dimensional problem, and it became prohibitively expensive. And that's why they had to use GPUs. And that's
so this is why you're focused on syntax.
Right. You start with syntax. You can parse it at a millionth of the cost, at a millionth of the energy. And the resulting small syntax model that you get is still powerful enough to do classification, and it may be good enough to do dialogue. We don't know.
What will it take to learn? What will it take to prove that?
I would need a much larger machine. At the moment, I'm doing all my research on an ICANN 128 gigabyte Macintosh from 2013. So I've been working for 9 years on a pretty puny computer to do this, and I was forced to basically learn how to do it with little resources.
Wow.
But if you wanted to learn enough English to compete with ChatGPT, I would have to basically run the experiment, and the experiment itself requires a machine that costs $70,000. And I don't have that kind of funding, so I can't do this. But I would love to have somebody get me access to a machine, or give me a machine with 4 terabytes of RAM and 128 cores.
Monica, you need a rich benefactor. That's what you need.
A rich benefactor. No, I need a mildly rich benefactor, because I don't need more than that $70,000 to prove my point.
A patron.
But your forecast is that we'll be able to run the syntax models with 1 million times less power consumption. What kind of microprocessors will you need? Will you still require a bank of NVIDIA GPUs, or are you saying that is currently required because they're dragging along?
So what's the configuration of the $70,000 machine?
It's 128 cores, 256 threads, 4 terabytes of RAM. It's a 2-mount rack server from Supermicro.
Okay.
Right on. Well, any other forecasts for our audience that you'd like to share? Like,
what's AI going to be like in 2050? Is it going to be her?
2015.
No, 2050, 50.
Sorry, I misheard. 2050. Oh, we have no way of doing it. We have no way of saying what the AI is going to look like in 2030. Sorry.
No problem. I thought I'd ask.
No, I think that so the model of AI that I like to see going into the future is basically the young lady's illustrated primer. Anybody not familiar with
Neil Stephenson?
Yeah, Neil Stephenson. So basically, I imagine basically AI being in your iPhone or in your iPad, whatever, and you put your AirPods in and you talk to it all day, and it talks back and makes sense. And in April it says, "Hey, I filed your taxes," and so on. So it does everything. It does a lot of the stuff that we do on a daily basis. It will do it for us, and it will basically have knowledge, which I call a US useful consensus reality corpus, which is basically everything a US citizen needs to know to be productive in society. And we should have AIs that know all of that stuff. And the cheapest implementation to help the bottom people at the bottom of the social ladder that have little skills, etc., may not even speak English, is to provide a phone number for them to call, and they can talk to their personal AI at any length, any time of day for advice, education, and friendship.
Okay, let me posit an alternative view there, though. That sounds like you're suggesting we're going to foster a dangerous dependency on technology where people won't have agency to solve problems on their own. We'll grow so used to relying on this AI on demand or this personal assistant.
But isn't that the case already today?
You have a cell phone, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how would you order a taxi without an app today?
Why would we hold
You
back?
can stand on the street and do that, but, you know.
What a statement, right? We already have the dependency. We're already there. Yeah. The nightmare scenario is already here.
Yeah, no, it's going to be that everybody has an AI in their phone, and some people pay more for theirs, and therefore it has more capabilities. And it could be that your boss will require that you have a good AI, because otherwise, why would they hire you?
Wow. Well, Monica, it has been a great pleasure having you on the show. We've enjoyed your perspectives. It's always a refreshing conversation. Thanks for joining us on The Futurists this week. Where can people find your work? Give us the URLs where they can find your writing and the Zirioth principle and so forth.
Certainly. My main publishing site is experimental-epistemology.ai. And I also have a Substack called Zeroth Principles of AI, and a meetup group and a YouTube channel with the same name.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us this week. It's always fun to catch up with you. Brett, it's good to see you back in the saddle. Folks, thanks very much for listening to the show. Brett and I enjoy this tremendously, and we're getting great feedback from people. I want to give a thanks to Kevin Hershen, who very patiently goes through this and cleans up our audio and adds incredible music to it. Makes our show much, much better, much easier to listen to. So thank you, Kevin. Thank you to Elizabeth Severance and all of the crew at Provoke Media that make the show possible. We will be back next week with another futurist, another person who's thinking hard about the future. And until then, we will see you in the future. Well, that's it for The Futurists this week. If you like the show, we sure hope you did. Please subscribe and share it with the people in your community. And don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. That really helps other people find the show. And you can ping us anytime on Instagram and Twitter at Futurist Podcast for the folks that you'd like to see on the show or the questions that you'd like us to ask. Thanks for joining. And as always, we'll see you in the future.